All right, we want to welcome you to this video broadcast we're doing, and we have two special guests with us today, two men that personally I'm very proud of. I'm very glad that they're our representatives on the Executive Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention. It is Dwight Easler, who is the pastor of Corinth Baptist Church in Gaffney, and David Sons, who's the pastor of Lake Murray Baptist Church in Lexington. So, gentlemen, I want to welcome you both, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy.
Yes, sir. I want to. You've been through some rather grueling meetings in the last couple of weeks over the issue of sexual abuse and things related to that. And I want to just give a little bit of background. I think this goes back to 2019 when the Houston Chronicle did this investigative report and published it. And they listed at that time there were 700 victims of sexual abuse in Southern Baptist churches, and there were 380 people that were identified as abusers, and they mentioned that as many as 200 had either confessed, resigned from the church, or had been convicted and were spending time in prison. Coming out of that, the Southern Baptist Convention became more sensitive and aware about sexual abuse, and then there was a move to do something about it, which ended in a motion that came before the committee, the whole convention in June of this year. And then in a rather amazing turn of events, the executive committee themselves offered a motion, and somebody offered a motion rather, and it was referred to the executive committee. And then in an unusual move, the messengers appealed to that be heard from the floor. And you have to have a 2/3 majority to do that. And the motion passed overwhelmingly, and that became the marching order, so to speak, for an investigation. Now, the problem started when the executive committee then began to look at that motion and decide, well, we're going to make our own motion. So you had to deal with a motion from the officers of the executive committee that was not the same as the motion from the Southern Baptist Convention. And that led to a lot of other things. But in the process of all this, you ended up having 3 votes. At the first meeting, you had a vote, and I think it was 55-20 in the first vote, not to waive attorney-client privilege. In the second vote, it was 39-31.
I believe
It's 39, I think it was 39-35.
35, right.
39-35. And then this most recent thing was 46-31.
40. I think it was 44-31.
44-31, that's right.
31,
That's right. And that then became what the convention is going to work with.
Right.
And it was correct, I think, to do so because that was what the Southern Baptist Convention decided. So I guess the first question I would ask you two, because you're on the executive committee, is what does the executive committee do? What does it mean to be a member of the Executive Committee Board of Trustees?
In my understanding of it, as a 6-year member, does 2 primary things. First of all, we are the enforcers of what the messengers decide to do. Mm-hmm. So we collect the CP money. We make sure it gets to where the messengers have decided it goes. Mm-hmm. We also make sure that what the messengers vote to do is enforced, and we're a cheerleader for the cooperative program. Those are the 3, that's the primary role. I think the other role is to act between conventions ad interim, mm-hmm. where there's a decision that has to be made. A lot of things on the floor is referred to the executive committee, right. Which means the executive committee basically decides on matters for the convention between conventions, because the Southern Baptist Convention does not exist after the closing gavel until the next year.
The annual meeting.
Right, the annual meeting. So that should be the 2 primary roles of the executive committee, as I understand it. Beyond that, it becomes a matter of overreach, and that has been an issue through the years. And that has been really the discussion going on the role of the trustee versus the role of enforcing what the messengers have voted to do. That has been the big debate in these votes in the last 2 weeks, really.
Okay.
So just to build on what Dwight was saying, the executive committee, really, if you think about the executive committee, has two primary responsibilities. So if you think about your local church, the executive committee really operates kind of as the finance committee, in the sense that the executive committee receives allocations that have been given to the cooperative program. They receive the receipts that have been given to the cooperative program, and then they allocate those receipts as directed by the messengers to the entities. So International Mission Board, National North American Mission Board, all 6 seminaries, so on and so forth. They also, as Dwight said, operate ad interim between the annual meetings of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so many things at the Southern Baptist Convention are oftentimes referred to, as you mentioned in your opening, Rudy, to the executive committee to decide upon or to make a decision about and then return to the messengers. But ultimately, the responsibility of the executive committee is to be trustees. So we have, as we've heard ad nauseum the last few days, a fiduciary responsibility both to the executive committee and to the messengers of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so my understanding is that the executive committee works best when it works as a support for the entities and the institutions. It is our job really to make sure that the will of the messengers, what we have been told, that those things are happening, and then to really, as Dwight said, be a cheerleader for cooperative program works and cooperative program giving. And so, understanding that's kind of what we do. And we're seated by the messengers. We are nominated by the Committee on Committees. The Committee on Committees puts forward the nominations committee, and the nominations committee puts forward trustees for all of the entities, including the executive committee.
I guess the next question I had for both of you guys has to do with Baptist polity. That idea came up that if the executive committee could not follow the motion that passed overwhelmingly by the convention in June, if they could not follow that and they took a different course, then that threatened the whole idea of Baptist polity. Would you two talk a little bit about Baptist polity and this fiduciary responsibility? Tell us what a fiduciary does.
As far as fiduciary responsibility, we, as trustees legally of the entity, we have the role to protect the entity as well as do what's best for the entity, whether that be one of the seminaries or the mission boards or the executive committee. We serve as a trustee just like in those entities. We are responsible to protect that entity and do what is best for it. And that's really the dilemma that many people had on the executive committee going forward with this motion. While I did not sympathize with it, I felt like we were obligated to the messengers to figure out how to do what they had ordered us to do. Mm-hmm. There were some who felt like that to do the best for the entity, we had to go in a different direction than the messengers mm-hmm. voted to do, mm-hmm. Because of warnings and things that they took very seriously. So I think in that regard, I understand the dilemma that many people had voting to go forward with the messengers. However, I felt as someone who is responsible as a trustee, we could not oppose the will of the messengers in this and act responsibly. Mm-hmm. And we could not do what is best for the executive committee, who is already under a cloud of distrust and basically put the convention in crisis because mm-hmm. of it. Okay. So early on, as I understood what was happening, that was my decision, especially after the first day of meetings that we had in Nashville. It was very clear to me that we had to figure out a way to go with what the messengers had voted to do. That was the only way to be responsible as a trustee and do the right thing.
Really, what we saw here was three primary things. Number one, we had a crisis of polity. Number two, we had a crisis of trust with an entity, and then number three, we have the crisis of potentially mishandling of sexual abuse allegations and the mistreatment of sexual abuse survivors. And so, if we want to address the polity question first, it is true. Our polity, Southern Baptist polity, is unique. We are not a top-down organization, as some other denominations would be. We are a bottom-up organization, which means we are a cooperating network of autonomous local churches who have cooperated together for the purposes of missions and education. And so the headquarters of the Southern Baptist Convention is the local church. And so each summer, each June, when the messengers, when the convention convenes, messengers from all of these autonomous local churches come together and they decide on the business of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so the executive committee, as trustees of the Southern Baptist Convention, we have a responsibility to carry out the will of the messengers. Now, there are certain things at times that the messengers will refer to the executive committee and say, we trust you to handle this for us. But in this instance, particularly, as you mentioned in the opening, Rudy, this motion that was made by Grant Gaines and Ronnie Parrott regarding a full, transparent, independent investigation of the executive committee and their potential mishandling of sexual abuse allegations and the mistreatment of sexual abuse survivors. This motion was brought to the floor of the convention. It was attempted to be referred to the committee, and the messengers said, we don't want that to go to the executive committee. We want to handle that ourselves. And when they did, they voted overwhelmingly in favor of approving this motion for a full, transparent, independent investigation of the executive committee by a third-party independent investigator, and the development of a task force who would operate as a liaison between the investigator and the messengers, and basically to say that the EC would abide by best practices of the third-party investigator, including the waiver of attorney-client privilege. And I'm sure we'll get there in just a few moments. And so when the executive committee, in the first couple of our meetings, said that we are not willing or would really like to not abide by the will of the messengers, the sticking point primarily became the waiver of attorney-client privilege. When the entity said that, when we said that, it was, and you can find a Baptist historian to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the first time in our history where an entity of the Southern Baptist Convention has been given a direct mandate by the messengers, and that entity has said, no, we're not going to do what you have told us to do, what you've mandated for us to do. And so this creates all kinds of issues within our polity. Does the executive committee have the right to say, no, we can't or we won't to the messengers? And if it does, are we truly a bottom-up organization as we claim to be? Or if you have a body within the body who is able to say, we know better than the messengers, doesn't that become a top-down? Isn't there now a body within the Southern Baptist Convention who has governing authority that outpaces or usurps the will of the messengers? And so that's where we saw, I think, a polity crisis in this. It had been very clearly said, this is what the messengers want. And as the executive committee and as a trustee, and Dwight, I know, felt the same way. I won't speak for Dwight, but I know he feels the same way. We felt like that in the moment, the question was not, can we do this, but how do we do this? That we have been tasked to do this. And as as trustees, it's our responsibility to do it and do it in a way that meets the will of the messengers.
Because of the length of this video, we have divided it into two parts. You can watch the second part at our webpage, on YouTube, or on Facebook. Thank you for watching.